Chapter 25. Not Much of an Adventure. The gangly white wolf turned out to be Peter Claythorne, only son of Lady Claythorne. He had once been an animal control apprentice himself, back before the program had closed, although they were told this by Greenridge, and Peter seemed too embarrassed to talk about it. He was stooped and silent all through breakfast, as though he expected to be reprimanded for picking up his fork. When Lady Claythorne tasked him with giving the apprentice team a tour, her exact words were, "Keep the children occupied," he jumped and looked around as if an explosion had gone off. Still, once he warmed up to the group, he was quite friendly, and very knowledgeable about the fort. He was older than Jack would have thought, qualifying his stories with, "You're probably too young to remember," or, "Way back when I was an apprentice." Yet there was a boyish immaturity to him. He delighted in showing them the dungeon. "The prison cells are still usable," he'd said, "but the torture stuff is really just there for historical purposes, like a museum." The torture stuff was pretty horrific, Jack thought. A large iron casket called an inverse porcupine, a series of pulleys and chains that Peter called the giraffe maker. There was even something that looked horribly like a guillotine lying on its side. "Pretty gruesome, huh?" Peter said with a smile. The room Jack found most interesting was simply called munitions. It was also underground, but unlike the dungeon, this space was broad, not the least bit claustrophobic. One side of the room was lined with a security cage, behind which every imaginable type of weapon was mounted on a wall. When Peter flipped the light switch on, row after row of fluorescent lights shuddered to life throughout the room, revealing an arsenal of four-legged machines with caged seats on their fronts. They looked to Jack like monstrous bears on all fours, so enormous that even Greenridge would be dwarfed standing next to them. There were about 20, in one neat row stretching back into the expansive room. They were all pointing toward an upward-sloping ramp through which daylight poured, glistening against the remaining bits of icy sludge left from a recent shoveling. "These are the ice cats," Peter said as he gestured toward the machines with a sweeping arm. "Mostly they're used for plowing the roads." He pointed to one of the machines, which had an enormous shovel mounted to the front like a big steel bib. "But they were created as war machines, used for our protection. Imagine coming up against one of these guys." He paused. "They're piloted by the strongest, the best, not frail little wolves," he added, unable to disguise the bitterness in his voice. He turned toward them and shrugged. "So my mother says, anyway." He was quiet for a moment, nodding and pursing his lips awkwardly. "Well, that's munitions," he said. "Who's hungry?" They ate in the great hall again. Jack noticed that Peter chose a seat as far from the head table as could be found, even though it was empty. As the group ate, Peter shared a little more of the history of Safe Haven. The Helmet Mountain Range, he explained, was a natural barrier between Nicatia and Kersha. The carnivore-infested country to the north was an ever-present, yet currently dormant threat, he said, like an inactive volcano. Animals such as wolves and bears got along mostly fine, but non-predatory animals, which includes all of you, Peter pointed out, were preyed upon, even farmed, as he called it. Maddie seemed to lose interest in this part of the conversation. She asked Peter if there was an accessible phone nearby, and excused herself. "What do you mean by farmed?" Sprint asked, wearing an expression that suggested he wasn't sure whether he wanted an answer. "Farmed might be the wrong word, I'm not sure. Enslaved? Bred? 2 centuries ago in Nicatia, quads such as horses were slaves, bred and raised, the strongest with the strongest, to make powerful work animals that had no rights and were considered the property of others. In Kersha, that practice is still taking place, although it's not just for work animals. The fattest are bred with the fattest. You ever met a Kershan pig? They're enormous, and they're bred for, well, food." "But that's illegal," Jack said, horror-struck. "Not in Kersha, it's not," Peter said. "That's why we have Safe Haven, because the axe wound is an open ravine that leads directly through the mountains, easy access for the next invasion. Safe Haven is the plug. Centuries ago, a barrier was built, an enormous gate that closes off our end of the ravine. We call it Hard Stop. We safeguard the gate. If Safe Haven falls, it's open season in Acacia. Animal control will... Willie began. Will what? Peter fired up. His shy demeanor was all but gone. Will stop an invasion? He scoffed. How long did it take you to get here? I've made that flight many times. By the time animal control arrived, the damage would be done. There's plenty of space out here for enemies to hide. They're Kersians, not aliens from outer space. They look just like the rest of us. A whole lot more like me, to be fair, he added under his breath. Then he gave a gesture as if throwing off his own bad mood. It doesn't matter, he continued, his voice much more cheerful. We've got Greenridge, we've got the Ice Cats, and a whole lot more where they came from. We'll be ready for an attack. It's what this place was built for, after all. There was a commotion in the entryway. Jack turned toward the noise. Greenridge, the massive grizzly bear, was dragging someone roughly into the hall. The newcomer was a coyote, raggedly dressed and trapped in a headlock under the bear's left arm. Let go of me, you big idiot, the coyote said, tugging at his captor's arm. You already got shackles on me, haven't you? Where you think I'm gonna go?
Shut your mouth,
Greenridge growled, dragging the coyote further into the room and looking around.
I've seen more than one of you gnaw themselves free of a shackle. I'm not taking any chances.
Why would I run? The coyote demanded, jerking his head so hard his words sounded broken. Ain't done nothing wrong.
Where's Lady Claythorne?
Came a voice from behind them. Grayson Conway stepped into the great hall, covered from head to toe in snow gear. A rhythmic click came from the entrance to the left. What is the meaning of this? Lady Claythorne demanded, limping into the room on her cane. Greenridge turned, dragging the coyote, with a yelp, around with him.
Mr. Conway and his team are to be commended, my lady,
the bear said in his deep voice.
Together we've apprehended our murderer.
Claythorne looked the coyote up and down as though inspecting an item for sale. And what has convinced you so thoroughly of this? She asked, without taking her eyes off of the suspect.
We found these in the coyote's tent,
Conway said, gesturing behind him. Lude, the meditative sloth, was holding a stack of what looked like oddly shaped white blankets. Hoover groaned. That's disgusting, Sprint said, his voice faint. I see, Lady Claythorne said, leaving the coyote and approaching Lude. She grabbed the outermost in the stack, turning it over to expose dried leather skin on its underside. Jack turned away, unable to stomach the grotesque pile of furs. How could Lude stand to hold them? And these are the rabbits, I presume.
Roberts,
Conway called.
Come here, please.
Jack's heart skipped a beat. Me? He asked.
Yes,
Conway replied. His voice was gentle but firm.
We need you.
Jack stood from the table and approached, his knees feeling weak. Dixon grabbed his arm, pushed up the sleeve, and placed it alongside the pelt Lady Claythorne had been examining. Jack felt his fur rub against the dead animals. His head spun. Different color, the greyhound said, releasing Jack's arm, but it's the same fur.
Without a doubt, these are the victims, Conway concluded. And this is our killer, he added, thrusting a flight feather toward the coyote. No, that's a lie, the coyote said, his voice panicked now. These pelts are not mine. Holding them for a friend? Dixon jeered. The coyote's terrified words became inaudible as he dissolved into tears. Get this mongrel out of my sight, Claythorne said. Greenridge obediently dragged the sobbing coyote out of the room, followed by Lude and several Safe Haven falcons. When they had gone, Claythorne turned again to Conway and his team. Well done, Mr. Conway, she said, but her tone was troubled and uncertain. Was he acting alone? Conway shook his head. We found the feral camp, he said, near the river. I can see why you've had so much trouble locating those mutts. The whole camp is buried in the snow, tents and all. You raided their camp? She turned with an exasperated growl, taking a few canated steps toward them,
then turning again. "I thought I had made it clear, Mr. Conway, that I wanted you to investigate." She limped toward him. "You have no idea what you've done." "My lady, we did uncover the murderer," Pan protested. "And you've destroyed 10 years of peace. Before Magdalyanovsky returned, we were at war with the Ferals. You think snow-covered tents are hard to find? The coyotes set hothead traps. They know the trees. They're a pack of ghosts for all the good tracking does." She paused, regaining her composure with a sigh. "I'll send an envoy to the Ferals. If Gordon were here, well..." She looked to her wiry falcon assistant. "I suppose I'll have to make do with what I've got. Louder, gather the table. I want a team ready to meet the Ferals in the next hour."
"We'd be happy to do any outreaching," Conway started.
"You have done quite enough," Lady Claythorne interrupted. "I want you and your team and the children," she gestured to the apprentices, "out of here tomorrow morning."
"May I reiterate," Conway said, "that my team apprehended the murderer. We did so with minimal force and in only a few hours."
Lady Claythorne clicked her way toward Conway again. He was a head taller than she, but her aged face was fierce, tough as iron, and he faltered in his glare. "If Magdalyanovsky had something to hide," she said, her voice firm and level, "it would have been hidden."
"How can you be certain?"
"Because Magdalyanovsky," Claythorne explained, "is a clairvoyant. She sees events before they unfold. She will have known you were coming before you did, and yet she did not order the evidence to be destroyed. Do you see the paradox?"
"My lady," Conway started, but Claythorne held up a paw to silence him.
"The coyote will remain here for questioning." She began limping away, speaking over her shoulder as she left. "You will leave in the morning." The hall seemed to echo with the click of Lady Claythorne's cane as she strode away. Jack turned toward Conway and smiled. "Guess you could have used a sidekick after all." He didn't know why he'd said it. A feeble attempt at levity, perhaps, but he knew instantly that he'd said the wrong thing. The look Conway gave him was of deepest disgust, a look he'd never seen on the hero's face before.
"Exactly what is it that you think you could have done, Jack?"
Jack felt his ears droop. Nothing.
"Nothing,"
Conway agreed. The jackrabbit, Pan, stared at Jack with a furrowed brow, while Dixon smiled broadly, as if in amused disbelief at what he had just heard. The team followed Conway out of the hall, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Hours later, Jack lay awake in his bed. It was dark, with only moonlight through 2 narrow windows, and dying embers in the fireplace between them. For the second night, they'd found a fire crackling there, and for the second night, Willie insisted they extinguish it. "Do you have any idea what that will do to my skin?" he had groused. Jack stared blankly at the glowing embers, pulling the quilt tight around him and trying to forget the look Conway had given him. He didn't care much about what Pan or Dixon thought, but the more he knew Firebird, the more he came to respect him, even feel a sort of fandom toward him. Being made his sidekick, no matter how temporarily, still felt like some kind of daydream.
"Exactly what is it that you think you could have done, Jack?"
he had asked, and then,
"Nothing."
The words came back to him loudly in the dim quiet, and every time he thought of them, he felt another punch in the gut. He pushed his ears back and looked around the room. Sprint and Hoover were asleep in beds against the opposite wall, Willie in the bed to his right. A row of thick, wool-lined coats hung from hooks next to the heavy oak door. They'd been provided the previous night, presumably by the same housekeeper that had lit the fire. And much like the fire, they wouldn't get to serve their purpose. Of course, neither would the apprentices. Their first, and perhaps only, mission wasn't much of a mission at all. It wasn't much of an adventure either. Fly to Safe Haven, be babysat, fly home. Was it because of Jack? Because he shared a species with the victims? Or was there just something about him, something in need of coddling, protection? Dr. Walraven had kept him away from Treyarch, hadn't wanted to take him to animal control, had, for some reason, wanted to bring him here instead. For what? His thoughts were interrupted by a metallic grinding sound. It reminded him of the trash compactor back at the honey sap. The sound was joined by a soft crunching. That sound he recognized. It was the crunch of something pressing into snow. There was another grinding, another crunching. Footsteps. Heavy, mechanical footsteps. Kicking the quilt off, he moved to the window to the left of the fireplace. Several floors below was the cement ramp that sloped down into munitions. The snow that mounted up on either side of the ramp was deep, burying the first 2 floors of the fort. He traced the snow-plowed cement with his eyes. The ramp ended at a T-junction, carving a trench-like road that ran parallel to the fort. To the left, a section of the trench wall had collapsed, like a birthday cake that had been scooped at by a toddler. Along this newly formed trail, 2 of the mechanical ice cats were crunching their way through the snow, away from the fort, and into the darkness. There was a louder grinding directly below him. He flattened his nose against the cold glass and peered straight down. A 3rd ice cat was stomping its way up the ramp, its caged cockpit rattling with each mechanical step. But there was something odd about this. It was early, maybe 3 in the morning. Admittedly, Jack didn't know anything about how things were done here at Fort Safehaven. Maybe they plowed the roads this early. But none of these ice cats were adorned with the giant shovels he had seen before. The early hour and the lack of shovels weren't what bothered Jack. What bothered him was that, despite the darkness of the early morning, neither of the machines in the distance, nor the one below him, had any lights on. Jack was certain he'd seen headlights and little orange lights along the legs when they'd been up close to the ice cats. But the further machines were now completely hidden in darkness, and as the nearer machine reached the top of the ramp and turned left, its pilot turned his head toward the fort. In the light cast from the rooftop, Jack could make out the face of Greenridge, the grizzly general. There was something suspicious in his look, as if he was ensuring that he hadn't been seen or followed.
Exactly what is it that you think you could have done, Jack?
As he watched Greenridge follow the other ice cats into the snowy darkness, Jack thought of the response he had given. Nothing. Well, perhaps it was time to do something.